In the summer of 1945, the United States government made a decision that has never fully appeared in any official history textbook. The war in Europe had just ended. The trials at Nuremberg were being prepared. The world was told that those responsible for the most systematic campaign of state-organized harm in the 20th century would face justice. But inside a series of classified meetings, some held in bombed-out buildings in occupied Germany, others in quiet offices in Washington, D.C., a very different plan was taking shape. Certain individuals would not face those tribunals. Their records would be altered. Their pasts would be reclassified. And they would be brought inside the most powerful intelligence apparatus in the world. Not as prisoners, as employees. The agreement that made this possible was never put to a public vote. It was never debated openly in Congress. And for over 50 years, the U.S. government officially denied it existed. This is the story of what they were really afraid of, and the deal they made to stay ahead of it. To understand what happened in 1945, you need to understand one man. His name was Reinhard Gehlen. And by the final years of the Second World War, he was the head of Fremdheerost, Foreign Armies East, the Nazi military intelligence division responsible for tracking every movement of Soviet forces along the Eastern Front. Gehlen was not a battlefield commander. He was something more valuable and more dangerous than that. He was an archivist of secrets. Over years of operation, his division had assembled one of the most comprehensive intelligence networks ever constructed on Soviet military capacity, political structure, and internal vulnerabilities. Thousands of informants. Hundreds of files. Detailed maps of Soviet supply lines, command hierarchies, and operational weaknesses. When it became clear that Germany would not win the war, Gehlen made a calculation. In early 1945, before the final collapse, he ordered his team to microfilm the entire archive. The originals were destroyed. The microfilm copies were sealed inside steel drums and buried in the Austrian Alps, a precise, deliberate act of preservation. Gehlen wasn't hiding evidence. He was creating leverage. He surrendered to American forces in May 1945. But he did not surrender as a prisoner. He surrendered as a man with something to offer. His opening proposition was straightforward. The Soviet Union, he told his American contacts, was not an ally. It was the next threat. And he had information the United States did not, could not, have gathered on its own. Years of field intelligence. Established networks behind what would soon become the Iron Curtain. Sources still in place. The Americans listened. What followed was a series of negotiations that bypassed the normal chain of command. Gehlen was transported to Washington, not in restraints, but in classified comfort. He met with senior figures in U.S. Army intelligence. He was given the opportunity to present his archive, his networks, and his vision for what a new intelligence partnership might look like. The men making these decisions knew what Gehlen was. His organization had operated in close coordination with units responsible for some of the most severe actions on the Eastern Front. Documents declassified decades later would confirm that members of his network had participated in operations against civilian populations. This was not unknown information at the time. It was weighed, considered, and ultimately set aside. The calculus was simple, if deeply uncomfortable. The Cold War was already beginning before the last shots of the previous conflict had been fired. The Soviet Union had emerged from the war as a superpower with nuclear ambitions and territorial reach across half of Europe. American intelligence networks in Eastern Europe were virtually non-existent. Gehlen had what the United States needed. And in exchange for that archive, and the networks attached to it, the United States was prepared to offer something extraordinary: protection. The formal arrangement was signed in 1945 and came to be known internally as the Gehlen Agreement. Under its terms, Gehlen and his core team of former Nazi intelligence officers would be reconstituted as an organization under indirect American sponsorship. They would continue their intelligence work, now directed entirely against the Soviet Union. They would maintain their existing networks in Eastern Europe and expand them where possible. In exchange, their wartime records would be protected from prosecution. They would receive funding, logistical support, and, critically, a degree of operational independence unusual for any U.S.-sponsored entity. The organization was initially called the Gehlen Organization, or simply, the Org. It operated out of a compound in Pulich, Bavaria, just south of Munich. From the outside, it looked like any other administrative facility in post-war Germany. From the inside, it was a functioning intelligence service staffed almost entirely by men who had spent the previous decade serving the Nazi state. For years, the CIA, formally established in 1947, maintained a relationship with the org that was simultaneously essential and deeply uncomfortable. Internal CIA documents, many of which remained classified until the early 2000s, show that agency officials were aware of the backgrounds of key org personnel. Memos from the period reference concerns about individuals within the network whose wartime activities were described as, and here the language of the documents becomes carefully bureaucratic, problematic from a political standpoint. Those concerns were noted. They were filed. And in most cases, they were overridden. One declassified CIA review from the 1990s, released as part of the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act of 1998, would later acknowledge that the agency had, in its own words, a moral and ethical problem with some of the relationships it maintained during this period. But that review came 50 years after the fact. In the late 1940s and through the 1950s, the org was considered too valuable to scrutinize too closely. The network delivered intelligence. Some of it proved accurate. Some of it, historians later established, was fabricated or exaggerated, a finding that raised serious questions about how much of the Cold War's early threat assessments were shaped by men with their own reasons to make the Soviet threat appear as large and as urgent as possible. Gehlen himself was described by American handlers in contradictory terms: brilliant, indispensable, difficult, untrustworthy. A 1952 CIA internal assessment obtained through later declassification described him as someone who operates according to his own agenda while simultaneously calling his network irreplaceable. The org would operate, funded and protected, for over 2 decades. In 1956, it was transferred to the newly formed West German government and officially renamed the Bundesnachrichtendienst, the BND, which remains Germany's foreign intelligence service to this day. The files that might fully explain what was known, when, and by whom, many of those files remain classified. The fullest accounting of what the Gehlen Agreement actually cost came not from journalists, not from congressional hearings, but from a document the U.S. government quietly released in 2001. That year, following the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act passed by Congress in 1998, the CIA declassified approximately 1,100 pages of records related to the Gehlen Organization. Historians Richard Brightman and Norman Goda, commissioned by the National Archives to analyze these documents, published their findings in 2010 under the title Hitler's Shadow. What they found was methodical and disturbing. The Gehlen Org had not simply employed men with inconvenient wartime backgrounds. It had actively recruited individuals who had been personally involved in some of the most severe operations of the Nazi era, including figures connected to units that had conducted mass actions against civilian populations in occupied territories. Several of these individuals were, at the time of their recruitment, being actively sought by European prosecutors. Under the protection of their relationship with American intelligence, they were unreachable. Brightman and Goda identified specific cases in which U.S. officials had intervened, either directly or through bureaucratic inaction, to prevent the extradition or prosecution of Org-connected individuals. In at least one documented case, a European government's formal request for information on a suspected individual was deflected by American officials on the grounds that the individual in question was involved in sensitive ongoing operations. The operation took priority. The accountability did not follow. Perhaps the most significant finding concerned the quality of the intelligence itself. For decades, the justification for tolerating the Gehlen network's composition had been operational necessity. The information was too valuable, the networks too embedded to be replaced. But the declassified record told a more complicated story. CIA analysts reviewing the org's output in the early 1950s had raised internal concerns that a significant portion of the intelligence being delivered was either unverifiable, recycled from outdated sources, or in some cases demonstrably inaccurate. One analyst's memo from 1953, declassified in the 2001 release, noted that the reliability of org reporting cannot be established with confidence, and that this had been known for some time. The intelligence services of several NATO allies had reached similar conclusions. British intelligence in particular had grown deeply skeptical of org output by the mid-1950s, with internal assessments questioning whether the network's value had ever matched its cost, financial, political, or ethical. None of this stopped the relationship. The org continued to operate. Gehlen continued to be treated as an asset. He retired in 1968, published a self-serving memoir in 1971, and passed away in 1979, never prosecuted, never formally called to account. His role in the post-war intelligence structure acknowledged only in the fine print of documents most people would never read. The agreement that had protected him, and the men around him, remained one of the least examined chapters of the Cold War. Until the files came out. Here's the question that the declassified files don't answer, and maybe can't. If the intelligence the Gehlen Organization provided was, by the CIA's own internal assessment, unreliable, if the threat estimates it produced may have been inflated by men with reasons to exaggerate, then what exactly did the United States get from this agreement? And what did it give up? Not just in terms of accountability for the past, but in terms of the decisions made about the Soviet threat, about Cold War policy, about where resources went and where they didn't, decisions shaped, at least in part, by intelligence from a network whose credibility was privately doubted while it was publicly indispensable. We'd like to know what you think. Leave it in the comments. And if history that wasn't meant to be found is what you're here for, you know what to do.